Hello, my name is Destiny, and welcome to my channel, Destined by Design for You. Today's message will be another installment in the series called When in Babylon. And today we'll specifically be looking at the life of Joseph and how Joseph is a model for us as children of God, for how we can live as citizens of the kingdom of God while we are here on earth. We will specifically be taking references from Genesis chapters 39 through chapter 45. Now, just like Daniel, Joseph has the favor of God on his life, and we see this from the very beginning of his story. But one of the key differences between the story of Daniel and the story of Joseph is that Daniel ended up as an exile in Babylon because of the sins of Judah, and Joseph ended up as a slave in Egypt because of the jealousy of his brothers. When we come into Joseph's story, he is a 17-year-old and he is the favored son of his father, Jacob. And this is where his story begins. But one of the key themes in the story of Joseph is the roller coasters of high and lows that he faces. He starts off as the favored son and then ends up as a slave in Egypt. And just as he finds himself exalted in the house of his master, in the highest position in his master's home, he then is falsely accused and sentenced to prison. But then, even in prison, he has the favor of God and he is exalted as a leader in the very prison where he's trapped. And even though he serves many years in this prison, it is after this time that God exalts him to the second highest ruler in the entire land of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Joseph's story is marked by these incredible highs and lows, and how just when it doesn't seem like things could ever change, Joseph finds favor even in his darkest hours. And that is what we're going to look at today is how Joseph went through those highs and lows without becoming bitter, without becoming unfaithful. So, as I said, we're going to start at Joseph at 17. Joseph was the favorite son of his father, Jacob, and he had had several dreams that he would be exalted above his family, even above his parents. And so, besides being his dad's favorite, he also had these dreams, making his brothers exceedingly jealous of him. So much so to the point that they plot to kill him only to change their minds and sell him into slavery. And we're going to come into his story at Genesis chapter 39, starting in verses 1 through 6. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So what we see is even though Joseph was sold into slavery because of the jealousy of his brothers, he finds favor. God's favor goes before him. And even in his enslavement, he is exalted in Potiphar's house to the head position so that everything Potiphar has is put into Joseph's hand. And God not only blesses Joseph, but he blesses Potiphar and everything in Potiphar's home. So we see this favor. And even though he has this favor, just like Esther and Daniel, we don't see him letting this favor corrupt him. We don't see him becoming slack. He remains faithful. And this is proven when we get to Genesis chapter 37, verses 7 through 20, when his first real test comes. And it says, "And it came to pass after these things, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master willeth not what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he hath to my hand, and there is none greater in his house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. And there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. And he came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled, and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. So, what we find is that Joseph is so faithful that when Potiphar's wife presses him, he refuses. He refuses to sin against his master, and he refuses to sin against God. Nevertheless, Potiphar's wife keeps pressing. And Joseph keeps remaining faithful, even to the point of fleeing. But we find that even though he was faithful, even though he was without fault, he is falsely accused and imprisoned. And at this point, it seems like Joseph's life has been thrown back into that pit. First, he is the favored son, only to be betrayed by his brothers and sold as a slave. You would think that as a favored son and as a young man, that alone would have broken him. But yet again, just when his life was starting to get better, he finds himself back at his lowest. But what we find is that just like when his brothers betrayed him, Joseph remained faithful. When we get to Genesis chapter 39 and we start in chapter 21, finishing in 23, we find, But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made prosper. So he was no longer a slave, but he was now a prisoner. And even though he had been betrayed yet again, he serves faithfully. God gives him favor with his jailer, and the jailer, just like Potiphar, puts everything under Joseph's charge. And Joseph yet again serves faithfully. And eventually, two of Pharaoh's servants are brought to this same prison, and Joseph is serving them. And one day they wake up and they've had each a dream that's troubled them. And Joseph tells them that he can interpret their dream through God. And so the butler and the baker tell Joseph their dreams. And just as Joseph interpreted, the butler is raised back to his position and the baker is put to death. And Joseph had asked the butler to remember him when he was exalted back to his position. But what we find is that the butler did not remember Joseph once he was brought out of prison. What we find is that in Genesis 41 and 1, it says, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river." So, what it shows us here is from the time that Joseph interpreted the baker and the butler's dreams to the time that he is brought before Pharaoh, it was a full 2 years. And here's what happens in Genesis 41, 15, and 16 when Joseph is finally brought before Pharaoh. It says, "And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace." And then, after giving the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, Joseph says in Genesis 41, verse 25, "And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. The dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do." So even though Joseph is finally being brought out of the prison after everything he's faced, he remains faithful. He gives credit to God for the interpretation of the dream, and even gives God the credit for the dream itself, saying that God has given this dream to Pharaoh to tell Pharaoh what God is about to do. And because Joseph serves faithfully wherever he is at, and because Joseph gives God all the credit, we find in Genesis 41, verses 38 through 41, it says, "And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, For as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." Suddenly, Joseph is exalted. What seemed like an endless cycle of betrayal and brokenness ends. Joseph is now exalted to the second highest in all the land of Egypt. And this happened overnight. And we find that Joseph was 30 years old when this finally happens. This story started at the age of 17. He is exalted at the age of 30. In Genesis chapter 41 through verse 46, it says, "And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt." It had taken years, but finally, Joseph was no longer a slave. He was no longer a prisoner. He was now exalted to the second highest in the land, a man with no other report except for that he served faithfully. Just like Esther and Daniel, God's favor went before him because of his faithfulness and because of his obedience. And Joseph is a model to us of Luke chapter 16, verses 10 through 13. "And he that is faithful in with that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if ye have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon." It didn't matter whether Joseph was a slave, a prisoner, or a ruler. Joseph served faithfully. wherever he went. And God blessed him, continually putting things into his hands. And all of these things, because he was faithful as a slave, because he was faithful as a prisoner, God knew that when he exalted him to the highest in the land, second only to Pharaoh, that he would be ready and able to serve faithfully then. If we are not faithful in the small things, we will not be faithful in the big things. But if we are faithful in the small things, then when God brings us into those bigger things, we will remain faithful. And so all these things that Joseph went through were to prepare him for the position that God had intended for him all along. And what we find is that now Joseph is blessed with a home, a wife, and children of his own. It says in Genesis 41, verses 50 to 52, and unto Joseph were born two sons before the years of the famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God, he said, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God had caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. We don't see Joseph rolling in pity. He's not sitting there in self pity going, why do all these terrible things happen to me? Surely he had his doubts. Surely he had his struggles. But what God puts forth in his story is that wherever Joseph was, he was favored. And that whatever was put into Joseph's hands, he did and used faithfully. And again, because he was faithful in the little things, faithful in the hard seasons, God knew that he would be faithful in the big things and faithful in the good seasons. To the point that when he was finally exalted, he was given a family and a life of his own greater than he could ever imagined. And that's exactly what God wants us to do. Wherever we are to serve him faithfully. As we talked about previously, obedience comes before that favor. It is that obedient heart that brings us into that favor of God. If we are willing to be obedient unto God, his favor will follow us. But when we are in that favor, are we going to continue to be obedient? Are we going to serve faithfully, even when things don't look like what we think they should, or even when things don't seem fair or just? Are we going to serve him in those valleys, serve him in those hard seasons, serve him in those low places? And if we will serve him even there, when it is time for God to exalt us and bring us into something bigger, into something better, then he knows that our hearts will be ready to be faithful even then. Now, unfortunately for Joseph, that even once he entered this high position, this was not the end of his struggles. There would be yet another test that would come to him. But we are going to go and talk about that in part 2 of this message. So I hope you will join me again for When in Babylon, Joseph, part 2. But until then, take this with you. Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 and 24. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily, as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. Just like Joseph served faithfully as a slave, just as he served faithfully as a prisoner, just as he served faithfully when he was exalted to the second highest in the land. Wherever the Lord places us, work as unto the Lord and not unto men, and serve him with faithfulness. And then you will be amazed at what God can do with our faithfulness and with our obedience, and the favor of God that will go before us. Until next time, keep loving the Lord, keep growing in him, and keep living as children of God here on earth. See you in part 2.